The Epilepsy Foundation is pleased to share with you an educational webinar, What's New? Novel Approaches in Epilepsy Therapy. The mission of the Epilepsy Foundation is to lead the fight to overcome the challenges of living with epilepsy and to accelerate therapies to stop seizures, find cures, and save lives. Tonight's educational webinar is brought to you with support from NeuroPace. My name is Dr. Elaine Kiriakopoulos, and I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who has joined us this evening. It's wonderful to have you with us for this important and hopeful learning opportunity. I'd like to review with you the format for tonight's webinar. During the speaker presentations, all phone lines will be muted. We would like to encourage everyone to submit their questions at any time during the webinar. To do so, type your questions into the question window on the GoToWebinar panel and click Send. We will read your questions aloud during the question and answer portion of the webinar. Please try to keep your questions general in nature, as the webinar is intended for educational purposes. This webinar does not take the place of individual medical advice. The webinar will be recorded and available for viewing and listening on epilepsy.com. The Epilepsy Foundation is working to provide information and education that serves the spectrum of individuals and families impacted by epilepsy. It is common when you have a question about your health or your loved one's health, you may hear or read things that you are not sure how to interpret. Next slide, please. The Foundation's webinar education series aims to bring together expert clinicians and scientists who can share with you the most up-to-date and accurate information to help answer your questions. Next slide, please. Our hope is that tonight's webinar will help you to better understand the advances we have seen in epilepsy, as well as the progress which is to come. The past decade has been explosive for science and medicine, with remarkable, meaningful advances in many different fields. These advances are heralded regularly in news headlines like you see here on this slide. In these headlines, you can see the excitement around advances that have been made and the optimism for the breakthroughs that are still to come. Next slide, please. This quote really summarizes well how far things have come in the past decade. Dr. Joy shares, "I'm no longer talking about promising developments down the road, but therapies that are here now." Next slide, please. I would like to take just a few moments to share with you how the Epilepsy Foundation has been supportive of advancing science and medicine, aiming for better health outcomes and quality of life for each person affected by epilepsy. Some of you may recognize one or more of these monitoring technologies, diagnostic tools, treatment devices, medical therapies, or awareness initiatives that are on this slide. These are all advances that have come to be realities and are available now. The Foundation and you, our epilepsy community, have played a role in this progress, and we want to thank you. Next slide, please. Tonight, with the help of our guest speakers, we're going to learn about what is new in epilepsy, the latest. This includes recent advances in therapy and who might be eligible for or benefit from a new therapy. We will share with you how to best explore new treatment options and hope to help you better understand the impact that research and clinical trials in epilepsy can bring. We will also discuss the role of the Epilepsy Foundation in much of this work and opportunities for you to participate in these efforts. Next slide, please. I am thrilled to be able to introduce to you our guest speakers for this evening, as they represent leaders at the Foundation, nationally and internationally, that are guiding progress towards improving diagnosis and treatment options for people living with epilepsy. Dr. Jacqueline French is a professor of neurology in the epilepsy section at the New York University Langone Medical Center, and currently serves as the Chief Scientific Officer of the Epilepsy Foundation. She has been instrumental in spearheading initiatives to advance research directly benefiting people impacted by epilepsy. As a clinician and scientist, Dr. French is in tune with the urgent need to find solutions for people with epilepsy and has been able to forge collaborations worldwide to address this need. She has helped to build pathways leading to innovative technology, drug discovery, and improved treatments for epilepsy. Dr. French has set a goal of actively fostering the kind of research that can make a difference to people with epilepsy in a time frame that matters. Dr. French has been committed to the Epilepsy Foundation's mission for over 2 decades, having served in multiple leadership roles within the Epilepsy Foundation and the Epilepsy Therapy Project. In addition to having served as president of the American Epilepsy Society and currently serving as director of the Epilepsy Study Consortium. The Foundation is grateful for her service, passion, and commitment to the epilepsy community. Thank you for being here with us tonight, Dr. French.
Absolutely my pleasure.
Dr. Brandy Fureman has served as the Vice President of Research and New Therapies at the Epilepsy Foundation since 2016. She oversees all Epilepsy Foundation research programs and priorities for innovation, engagement, and research training. She has successfully led the implementation of various research initiatives, including the Research Roundtable in Epilepsy, Epilepsy Foundation pipeline conferences, and other foundation activities to engage patients and families in the research process. She's a principal investigator of the Rare Epilepsy Network, the Epilepsy Learning Healthcare System, and the Human Epilepsy Project. As a scientist, Dr. Fureman embraces challenges and works to find solutions that help to advance our understanding of epilepsy. Her leadership and collaborative vision have enabled the Epilepsy Foundation to engage key stakeholders in science, clinical medicine, and industry to bring progress and hope for individuals and families impacted by epilepsy. Next slide, please. I would like to take a moment to share with you our guest speaker disclosures, which will be available to you on the webinar recording. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. At this time, I would like to turn things over to Dr. French. Jackie, thank you. Take it away.
Hi, thanks, and welcome everybody. It's wonderful to be here. There's going to be a lot of material tonight, so if you have any questions, as you heard, you can type them in the box and we'll try and address them later. So let's go to the next slide. So you may wonder why this session on new therapies is starting with a discussion of epilepsy classification. And the reason is that I can't tell you about new therapies without telling you what they're good for. And the International League Against Epilepsy actually recently changed its epilepsy classification. So I just wanted to very briefly go over it with you so you understand when I start talking about the new therapies. So the very the most common type of epilepsy is what we call focal epilepsy. And that's easy to understand because it comes from one focal area of the brain, and seizures start in that focal area. And that focal area has an electrical disturbance, and it can be for a number of different reasons, whether it be a little scar there, or a group of cells that migrated in the wrong direction when the brain was being formed, or a little brain tumor, or a little stroke, or sometimes we don't even know why, but seizures start in a focus and they can spread from that focus to cause loss of awareness and larger convulsive seizures as well. Can you flip to the next? And the second most common type of epilepsy we call generalized epilepsy. And generalized epilepsy is a genetic type of epilepsy that starts sometime in childhood, usually between school age up to the time when people go off to university. And it starts in all of the brain at once because the brain, for genetic reasons, is wired slightly unusually, and that leads to seizures. So that is the second most common type of epilepsy. And then you see another box in green here that's called generalized and focal epilepsy. And generalized and focal epilepsy has both seizures that start in focus and seizures that start in a generalized fashion. And the whole brain tends to be hyper-excitable. And this type of epilepsy tends to start very early in childhood or even in infancy, and usually is associated with some abnormal development, abnormal ability to think or do other things as well, because the brain is very dysfunctional. Now, below this level of knowing that the seizures are either focal or generalized, or both focal and generalized, we can identify certain syndromes. If you click the next button. So the syndromes fall under the boxes. So there's only one syndrome that goes under focal, and that is focal epilepsy. But under generalized, we have a number of different syndromes that fall within that class, including something called juvenile myoclonic epilepsy that usually starts in adolescence, absence epilepsy that is staring spells that happen in childhood, and other syndromes. And under the box called generalized and focal, again, the epilepsies that are quite severe and start in childhood, we have some very specific, although rare, syndromes. And these are called the rare epilepsies or the orphan epilepsies. And you heard that Dr. Fureman runs the Rare Epilepsy Network. And a lot of these types of epilepsies fall in the generalized and focal category. And you may have heard of some of these names of these syndromes, or you may not. Syndromes such as Dravet syndrome, which is due to an abnormal gene in the brain, or Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, there's CDKL5, and many others that fall into this category of combined generalized and focal that again start in infancy. And you will see that there has been recently quite a focus on development of new therapies for these very severe, rare pediatric epilepsies. And sometimes we know the cause of the epilepsy, and sometimes we don't. So you see the box on the bottom that says epilepsy with etiology, and you see on the side different things that can cause seizures: genetic, structural, metabolic, immune, infectious, or unknown. And one example I can give you is a condition which is again genetic called tuberous sclerosis. And that is an etiology where 80 to 90% of the individuals who have tuberous sclerosis will have seizures as well. And those seizures can fall into many different syndromes. Right now, most of the treatments that we have are focused on controlling seizures. That is, they are seizure suppressing, and it doesn't really matter what caused the epilepsy. But we do hope that in the future, and I'm going to talk about this just a little bit, we have also treatments that specifically address what's wrong with the brain. For example, in tuberous sclerosis, we know that the genetic abnormality causes overgrowth of tissue in the brain in little lumps called tubers, and we know exactly what pathway has gone awry that causes these growths in the brain to form. And we also now have a therapy that specifically tries to correct that abnormal pathway. So in general, we would much rather be targeting what's wrong with the brain. But in the meantime, since there are a lot of epilepsies where we don't even know what's wrong with the brain, we have to treat the seizures and suppress the seizures. And usually when we do that, we are targeting syndromes. Next slide, please. The other important thing that I want to bring to your attention is what happens to the majority of people who develop epilepsy. And this is data that has been redone over and over and over again in a number of different studies and reconfirmed. And what it shows is that if people show up with seizures and their doctor gives them a drug, the first drug that they get, and it really in many ways doesn't matter which drug it is, it could be a number of different drugs, the first drug is going to get about half of people under control, and they won't have seizures anymore as long as they continue to take that drug. So about half of people respond to the first drug, and then another about 13% or so respond to the second drug that they're given. And between that first and second drug, about 2/3 of people, as long as they continue to take their medication, will be free of seizures. Unfortunately, if people continue to have seizures despite that first drug and the second drug, you can see here that when people try a third drug, a fourth drug, a fifth drug, or try combining different drugs, they can't get that many more people to be controlled. So you're either in the group of people who are treatment sensitive and respond to a lot of different medications, that 2/3, or unfortunately, you're in that 1/3 that don't respond. Next slide. So the question, do we need more new anti-epileptic drugs? Well, we've had a lot of development of new drugs, but yet we still have that 1/3 to 40% here represented as the little blue faces that do not get control. No matter how many new drugs we keep developing, they still are going to continue to have seizures. And unfortunately, there are several studies that show that despite all of the drugs that we've developed over the last decade or so, or 2 decades, that percentage of people has not changed. Now, that doesn't mean that those people are not better than they were 2 decades ago. They may have fewer seizures, their seizures may be less severe, but they're still having seizures. And our goal is to eliminate seizures altogether. Next slide. And it's also important to remember that those 60 or 2/3% of people who are well controlled are not necessarily well controlled and happy, because about half of those are having side effects every day of their life that they tolerate because they don't want to have seizures, and that's very understandable. I always say that my goal is to give people medication that I personally would be happy to take. And I hate it when, as a physician, I come to the point where I have to say to somebody, listen, this may not make you feel all that good, but unfortunately at this point, we're out of other options and we need to give you this medication. So our goal is not only to have drugs that improve the equation in terms of the number of people who have no seizures at all, but also improve the equation of the number of people who can take their medication on a regular basis and feel completely normal, as if they weren't taking medication at all, except that they're not having seizures. So even some of the newer drugs still have important safety and side effect problems, and we want better drugs, we want safer drugs. Next slide. So what is our current treatment paradigm? When I see somebody in the office, I'm going to start by giving them what I think is a safe and effective, well-tolerated first drug that I hope will make them feel completely normal. And I hope that they're going to be in that treatment-sensitive group and they'll do well. If they fail that first drug, I'm going to try a second drug, and I might try several drugs in combination. If they don't respond, then they fall into that 1/3 of people that we now call drug resistant. And again, no matter how many drugs I try after that, I can get a few of them seizure-free, but I'm not going to get a lot of them seizure-free by just changing drugs and changing drugs. I might get the seizures better, I might get them better controlled, I might get them to be a little less intense, but the likelihood of getting them under control gets lower when they've failed those two drugs. Then we get into a whole other group of things that I might be offering them because the drugs are not working well. And you see them here: ketogenic diet, vagus nerve stimulation, which is a device that's implanted. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the newer surgical techniques of responsive neurostimulation, deep brain stimulation. And then there are two things to get rid of a focus: either removing the focus with surgery or now laser ablation, which I'm going to talk about later. If you give another click, you can see that these new therapies are not for everyone. So for example, the ketogenic diet is mostly for young children, and adults don't really do that well with the ketogenic diet, but it can be very effective in young children. And there will be, I'm sure, other webinars on that. I'm not going to be talking about that tonight. Vagus nerve stimulation is one of the few therapies that really is good for really a wide variety of different epilepsies. Whereas the other ones, the responsive neurostimulator and surgical intervention and deep brain stimulation, at least for now, and laser ablation, you have to have a seizure focus, and it has to be someplace that your medical team can locate it so that they can use these techniques. So again, we're in a situation where if you have a focal epilepsy, if that focus you can locate, then you may be able to do some of these other things. If you can't, then you're still going to be relying primarily on medication to treat your seizures, even if you are quote unquote drug resistant. And that is why we obviously need new therapies. Next slide. So this just illustrates all of the drugs that have been approved in the last 2 decades. They're all in red here, that have not changed the equation. So all of these drugs have been developed since the 1990s, and they have not been able to eliminate that 1/3 of people who are treatment resistant. And you can see at the very top is cannabidiol, or CBD. That was the drug that was most recently approved in 2018 for treatment, and I will show you exactly what it was approved for if you go to the next slide. So this slide shows what the recent approvals since 2000 have been for. And you can see that we have some new drugs since 2000, pregabalin, lacosamide, S-glycarbazepine, brivaracetam, that are approved for focal seizures. So again, those are the seizures that you would take if you have a seizure focus and that focus can't be taken care of in some other way. There are also in green here examples of new therapies that have now been developed for what we call the rare epilepsies or the orphan epilepsies, such as rufinamide for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, vigabatrin for infantile spasms, clobazam for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and most recently, cannabidiol, CBD, for Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Now, the fact that these drugs were approved for these particular types of epilepsy does not mean that that's the only epilepsy that doctors will use them for. So clobazam is a good example, clobazam or Onfi. Although it was only approved for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, it actually seems to be broadly effective for a lot of different types of epilepsy. Some of the other drugs are not necessarily a good idea to use other than for the syndrome that they were approved for, but that's something that can be discussed with the medical team as to what drugs are going to be good for which patients. There is one drug, perampanel or Fycompa, that was approved for both focal seizures and more recently approved for primary generalized tonic-clonic seizures. So that's the only one recently that's been approved for purely generalized seizures. And you can see that many of the drugs were first approved in adults but have pediatric indications as well. Some of them do not. Next slide. So all of the drugs that I showed you that were approved for focal epilepsy were approved for all focal epilepsy, and they are being used for treatment sensitive, those 2/3 of people who respond to most drugs, as well as treatment resistant patients. But there's a new way of thinking, and that is that, and you might imagine this is true, that 1/3 of people that don't respond to medications may not have the same brain abnormality as the people who easily respond to medication. So rather than targeting everybody with epilepsy, some companies are now specifically saying, let's see if we can target those people who are not responding to drugs, go after those. And they're using specific animal models that are developed that reflect those people. And again, with the goal of creating drugs to work specifically for those people. And the hope is that in the next few years, when some of these new drugs come to the marketplace, that maybe we will make a dent in that 1/3 of people who now continues to be treatment resistant. Next slide. So here are a couple of drugs in the pipeline for resistant epilepsy. The next one that will be approved is a drug called Cenobamate, and I'm going to show you a little data on it. It's a pretty exciting drug for people who have not had their seizures controlled by other medications because it seems to be quite effective. Another one is called Padcevanil. It comes from the same, if people have heard of Keppra and Briviact, it comes from the same company that developed those two drugs. But again, it is very specifically being developed for people who don't respond to the standard medications. There's a follow-on compound to CBD called cannabidivarin. It's, again, it's one of the molecules that's found in medical marijuana that is being looked at. And then there is another interesting drug called natalizumab that is already being used for multiple sclerosis. And this drug actually targets inflammation in the brain and is given by a monthly infusion. So if you can imagine, instead of taking a daily pill, you come in once a month and have an infusion, and therefore you don't have to worry about day-to-day side effects of the medication, although this drug does have some safety concerns, which are being evaluated as well. A really, really novel concept that I had to put on this slide is from Bloom, and their concept is that actually, and this is something that many people in many areas of medicine are now studying, that actually the microbes in your gut that inhabit your gut, you know, on a daily basis, and we all have them, may actually in some ways influence your body and even influence your brain. And it may be by changing the type of microbes that are in your gut, you may actually be able to treat epilepsy. So that is a very novel concept, obviously. And, you know, further down the road, we're even talking about maybe doing gene therapies to fix the brain if there's a gene that's gone awry in the brain, but that's a few years away. Next slide. So I told you I'd show you some data on Cenobamate, and it's always difficult to show, you know, data on drugs because it's a complicated thing to look at. But let's take a look. So this is in a clinical trial where, in order to get into the trial, you had to be having at least 3 seizures a month. So that's a pretty high burden of seizures. And many people were having many more seizures like that, 10 seizures a month, or even 20, or even 40 seizures a month. And what they looked at here is after people were either randomized to taking a sugar pill on top of all the medication that they were already taking, or taking this drug Cenobamate on top of all the medication that they were already taking. And what you can see here is that if they were in the group that got the drug, which at the time was called YKP-3089, but now it's called Cenobamate, they had about a 1/3 chance of having a 90% reduction in the seizures that they were having in the trial, versus only 8% of the people who were put on placebo or a sugar pill in addition to the medication they were taking. And now this was a short study, it was only 6 weeks, but 25% approximately of people who were in the group that took this medication didn't have any seizures over that 6 weeks. So they came in with 4 seizures a month, but they had no seizures over that 6 weeks, about a quarter of them, compared again to only 8% of the people who had a sugar pill. So this is very encouraging. And, you know, I did this study, and I also have patients who are on this drug, and a number of them are seizure-free for years now on the drug. So we do think that this is going to be a very good option, and it's in front of the FDA right now. It should be the next drug that is actually approved for use in the clinic. Next slide. I do want to remind people with Cenobamate or with any other drug, give another click, that when a drug gets approved, this little yellow dot is an indication of what we know about that drug at the time that it's approved. And do another click. This big blue ball is what we don't know. So as the drug is used, over time, we learn about the drug more and more and more. So when you're trying out a new drug, such as Cenobamate, there have been about 3,000 people right now who have taken Cenobamate. 3,000 people is a lot, but it's not an enormous number. And, you know, the statistics say that when 3,000 people have been on a drug, we can rule out something that happens 1 in 1,000 times. But we can't rule out something that happens 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 20,000. So if this drug had a 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 20,000 really terrible side effect, we wouldn't know about it yet. So you have to understand that when you go on a new drug at the time it's approved, but obviously seizures are dangerous too. So we're always doing a risk versus benefit of when you use a drug versus how serious somebody's seizures are. Next slide. I want to take a minute to talk about rescue therapies, because there are some new rescue therapies that are very exciting that are in the pipeline. So what is a rescue therapy? A rescue therapy is a treatment that is not given every day, but is given when somebody is about to be in trouble or already knows they're in trouble. So it can stop a seizure cluster or be used when the risk of a seizure is higher than normal. So it's kind of like an EpiPen for seizures. And many people can benefit from having a rescue therapy available so that they don't have to go to the emergency room or lose a day to a seizure cluster. Next slide. So the only available therapy right now is a rectal formulation, which some of you may have heard of, and not everybody is excited about taking a rectal formulation of any drug, and it's a rectal formulation of a medication called Valium or diazepam. But right in front of the FDA right now, we have an alternative to those rectal formulations, which are rescue therapies that can be used in the nose. There are actually two. One is midazolam, called midazolam, and the other one is Valium or diazepam, but instead of being given rectally, that medicine is Diastat. This one is given in the nose. It's called Plumiaz. So nasolam and Plumiaz are almost certainly going to be available in the clinic within the next 12 months, and certainly will change the way people treat acute clusters. There is also a form of clobazam, the drug that I talked about before, that can be put into the cheek, buccal clobazam, that some people are going to use for rescue therapy as well, and that drug is called Sympazam. Also under development is alprazolam, which you can see the device here on the bottom that will deliver that drug, and that's sort of like an asthma inhaler. When you feel like you're maybe even having an aura or about to have a seizure, you can inhale this and it immediately delivers a lot of drug to the lung, and it may be able to work, we're hoping, in under 2 minutes to stop seizure activity, whereas the other medications, the midazolam, the diazepam, also work quickly, but more like 5 to 10 minutes. So all of these rescue therapies will be very useful in the clinic when they get there. Again, midazolam, nasolam and Plumiaz will hopefully be there very soon, whereas the inhaled alprazolam will probably be a couple of years behind them. Next slide. What does the future hold? Well, as I said, most of the drugs I'm talking to you about today are anti-seizure drugs. They suppress seizures in the brain without regard to what's causing the seizures. So they don't act to stop. They block either excitation, or they increase inhibition in the brain, or prevent repetitive cells from firing repeatedly. But as we gain a better understanding of what causes seizures, we hope that we'll be able to treat the root cause. And that could lead to disease-modifying treatments. When I explain this to people in the clinic, I often say, your seizures are kind of like a nasty spider that are crawling across the table at you. And what your doctor is really doing is taking a paper cup and just turning the paper cup over on top of the spider and immobilizing it. But the spider is still there and it's still alive. And that's why that cup, which represents the medication that you have to take every day, that cup is going to stay there for a very long period of time. If there was disease-modifying therapy, one would hope that eventually people could stop their medication because their epilepsy was actually gone. And that is the ultimate goal of our new therapies. Next slide. So I'm going to very quickly take you through the new devices, which are the deep brain stimulator, or the DBS, and the responsive neurostimulator, or the RNS, and the laser ablation, which is Visualase or Neuroblate. So next slide. So first is the stimulation of the anterior thalamus, and that is, again, the deep brain stimulator. And this one requires electrodes to be put deep in the brain. You don't have to know where the focus is for this. And there is a battery pack, as you can see in this illustration, that is in the chest. And that battery pack lasts for many years. And it goes to the deep brain. And like the vagus nerve stimulator, it goes off on a regular duty cycle, what we call a duty cycle, and it gives a little stimulus to the thalamus every 5 minutes, or on whatever schedule the doctor puts it. The strength and the duration of the stimulation can be adjusted, and when somebody feels like they might be getting an aura, they have a little device that they can put up against the battery pack in the chest, and they can cause the device to go off at that moment. And what that deep brain stimulator does is it generally increases the inhibitory tone in the brain, and it tries to stop seizures. Next slide. So this is what happened after 2 years into the study. Now, I'm showing you this data a little cautiously because the time that there was a placebo group, that is a sham group, that you can compare to the improvement of the treated group was very short. It was only a few months. And during that time, the improvement in seizures was not that great. But when these people were followed over time, it seemed like the improvement in seizures got greater and greater. Now, having said that, we don't know how much of that improvement, we're talking here on this figure, 2 years after the device was implanted. During that time, people could have started new medications, they could have adjusted their medications. So how much of the improvement was actually due to the deep brain stimulation is unknown. But what we can tell you is that 2 years after the device was implanted, about half the people, that's what a median means, had 56% or more improvement in their seizures compared to before they had the device implanted. Now you can also see that some of the patients were actually worse, not a large group, but some. But you know, again, more than half, half had more than a 56% improvement, and 6 of the patients were seizure-free. Now, 6 of the patients were seizure-free, and there were 81 subjects. So you can see that when we're talking about the issue of getting people seizure-free, this device is not going to get a whole lot of people seizure-free. But maybe some will become seizure-free, a small group. Next slide. So the trial, again, was in people with focal epilepsy. Eventually, this may be used for other epilepsies as well. They haven't been studied yet. It worked better for people with a seizure focus in the temporal lobe, did not work as well when the seizure focus was in the areas of the brain called the frontal, parietal, and occipital lobe. And there was a risk of complications because you are putting an electrode in the brain, of infection of about 10% and hemorrhage about 1.3% for every lead that was implanted. Interestingly enough, the people who had it put in also had a higher incidence of spontaneously self-reported depression, memory impairment, and anxiety. So we do worry about people who have those at baseline that maybe this is not going to be the best therapy for them. Next slide. The alternative is a responsive neurostimulator, which works with a very different mechanism. So this is 1 or 2 wires that are put near the focus. So again, for this one, you need to know where the focus is, and it continuously monitors what's going on at that focus. And when it says, uh-oh, there's a seizure starting here, it gives a shock to just that little area of the brain, as you can see where A1 is. So you see spike, spike, spike. And then the device says, this is not good, give a shock, and the spikes stop. And in the second panel, B2, you see another kind of seizure starting with rhythmic activity. The device says, this is not good, it's been programmed, it gives a shock, and that little seizure stops. So this device is programmed, and there has to be programming over time, adjustment, 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 to try and suppress seizures at the point where they begin. But that means you have to know what that point is. So this can sometimes work where they know where the seizure focus is, but they don't want to remove it because that might cause harm to the person because it's in a language area or a motor area or something else. Next slide. So the original trial was 171 patients. Half of them got sham stimulation. The other half got true stimulation. And during the last 2 months in the trial, there was a mean 29% decrease if they got the true stimulation, whereas the people who got the sham stimulation actually had a worsening of their seizures. And in the long term, 47% of the subjects had a 50% reduction compared to their baseline And there were a few complications in terms of the same kind of infection and other things that you saw with the DBS. Again, it looked just like with the DBS that things got better over time. And also, when you see last 12 weeks of treatment, that last 12 weeks was in the open label, which could be several years down the road. So over time, about half of people got a 50% reduction in seizures. But again, some people became seizure-free, but it was a small percentage, probably about the same percent as with the deep brain stimulation. Next slide. So the MRI-guided laser ablation is for eliminating a seizure focus when you know where it is and you can actually take it out. And it used to be the only way to take it out would be to actually remove it surgically, which means bringing somebody into the hospital and doing what's called a craniotomy, which is surgery on the brain and removing a big piece of tissue. But this is a little wire that goes right where that focus is and heats up at the tip and just destroys that area of brain where the seizure is starting. So it's much less invasive than an open surgery. It only requires an overnight hospital stay. The safety of this seems better, but it's early days, so we don't want to say anything for sure. Next slide. So in summary, the deep brain stimulator was just approved this year. It's the new kid on the block. It may be an option, again, for people where we don't know where the focus is. The RNS, we can now offer to patients who have a focus, but we can't remove it surgically. And the laser ablation is a safer way of removing a seizure focus when you can remove it. And there's been excellent results for certain types of lesions, including one called the hypothalamic hamartoma, including mesial temporal sclerosis and some other types of lesions. Next slide. So we have a robust pipeline. There are many new anti-epileptic drugs and new devices that are being evaluated in the clinic. Many more are going to emerge. Some are very promising. And I just want to remind you, and you'll hear it again, that every new drug has to undergo clinical trials, like the trials that I showed you, and we need the community's support to perform these trials and to recruit patients into the trials. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So this is Brandy Fureman. Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here as well. And my job tonight, if you go to the next slide, is to talk a little bit about the different kinds of clinical research studies that we need in order to develop new therapies and how to learn to use them in practice. But before I do that, I just want to stop and take a moment to acknowledge that we need these clinical research studies to get new therapies into the hands of our community. But the only way these studies are successful is if people with epilepsy and their families volunteer to be part of them. And I think that those volunteers are real heroes among our community members. And so I want to take just a second to say thank you to anyone who's listening to the webinar who has participated in a clinical study, because you really have done a service for your whole community, and I want to honor that. So thanks. Next slide describes at least 3 different types of clinical studies that we use to develop new therapies and then figure out how to use them best in practice. And they fall into categories like observational studies, interventional studies, and implementation studies. So observational studies are just like what they sound like, that there is little to no change to the treatments that you would be undergoing anyway. Your treatments are simply observed and your outcomes are recorded in an observational study. In some cases, there may be some additional procedures that are part of the study. For example, a biomarker study that might be looking for changes in the blood that correlate with seizure freedom or seizure exacerbation, for example, might involve an additional blood draw. compared to what you would otherwise experience in your clinical care. But otherwise, there is no change to the treatment that you and your physician decide is best for you at this time. That's in contrast to an interventional study, and Dr. French just described many different interventional studies where treatment is dictated by a study protocol, and that's because the interventional study is really the study that tells us whether a new approach, a new experimental drug or device compared to a control is actually safe and effective. And so in that case, the treatment that you receive in that study is directed by which group you are randomly assigned to, as opposed to the treatment that you and your physician decide you want to be taking at that time. So that's an important difference between an observational study and an interventional study. All of the FDA regulatory trials that are used to determine safety and effectiveness of new therapies are interventional studies. And the last category is implementation studies. And these are usually done with treatments that are already FDA approved, but as Dr. French mentioned, at the time of approval, we have actually a fairly small amount of information. We know that the treatment is safe and effective in a population of people in which it was tested in the trial, but that may have been only in, 100 people or a few hundred people. And an implementation study, you're looking at the effect of the treatment on large numbers of people, much broader kind of population to study the effect of the treatment. So next slide. I wanted to mention that the foundation has put together a tool that you can use to look for clinical studies that might be looking for people like you to volunteer for them. And this is called the Clinical Trials Portal. It's found on epilepsy.com. There's a place for you to search for clinical trials that might be actively recruiting people in your area. And then we also feature some clinical trials with a little bit more information and some graphics to help you understand the purpose of the study. The next slide. We also on the portal share information about studies that are not currently recruiting new patients, but are following those people. And then also we report on studies that have been completed and try to share the results of those studies with you, so that if you'd like to keep an eye on what's coming through the pipeline, this is another place that you can get that information. Next slide. So it's important to keep in mind that every clinical study that you might consider participating in has its own potential risks and benefits. And those risks and benefits are different in each and every study. In some observational studies, the risks are relatively low. They might be a risk of losing privacy if there was a breach in the data security of the study, but otherwise, they're simply observing the things that are happening in your regular clinical care. And so the risks above and beyond your experience in clinical care is not much more than that. On the other hand, in an interventional study, we're often looking at a new potential therapy or a new device that we really don't have much information at all about what the actual risks of that product may be. And so there, the risk may be significantly higher. On the other hand, the potential benefits may be higher because this may be a new therapy that has a much better capacity to control seizures than other existing therapies on the market. So that balance between the risk and the benefit is something that every person who is considering a clinical study needs to think through and be informed about. And that really takes us to one of the fundamental principles of clinical research, is that anyone who's participating in a study must be educated and understand what those potential risks and benefits are when they're thinking about participating. And that's called informed consent. And that's a process that if you're considering a clinical trial, you will go through with the study team so that you're sure you understand what it is that you're signing up for and what it is you'll be asked to do. Next slide. And I do want to mention that at every center that performs clinical research studies, there is an independent group of people called the Institutional Review Board. And this independent group of people is charged with overseeing that study to make sure that, number one, participants are getting informed and getting the chance to understand the risks and benefits before they consent to the study. And the members of that Institutional Review Board come from a number of different backgrounds. They are certainly physicians, nurses, statisticians, researchers, but also people who are on that board to advocate for patients. And so that group of people together are the group that oversees clinical studies that are done at that center. Next slide. So again, just to show a few examples of the different types of clinical studies, again, an observational study may be something like a cohort study, where you join the study and agree that your outcomes from your regular clinical care can be observed and that the researchers can learn from the outcomes that you have. Next slide. I wanted to share a study that the Epilepsy Foundation is helping to sponsor, and Dr. French's organization, the Epilepsy Study Consortium, is partnering with us to do this. It's called the Human Epilepsy Project 2, and at the next slide, this is an example of an observational study for people with resistant focal seizures. And the goal of this study is to really understand the experience of living with focal seizures that don't respond to medication. And the idea is that that understanding can help us develop new treatments that will better impact people with that resistant focal seizure profile. We will also be looking for biomarkers in this study to help us understand when someone may be more likely to have a seizure-free period versus ongoing seizures. So participants in this study will donate blood samples, they complete a daily seizure diary, they answer questionnaires, and they are compensated a small amount for their time participating in the study. Next slide. This study launched just about a year ago, and our goal is to get 200 participants enrolled at 10 centers across the country. The study will be going on for 2 years for each individual person. We'll follow people for 2 years. And the people who are eligible are between the ages of 16 and 65 years old. They have had onset of their focal seizures at any time, but they have at least 2 or more seizures a month. And they have tried and failed, including their current medications, at least 4 epilepsy drugs that are currently available. Next slide. So there is more information about this study available on these websites and on the clinical trials portal. And the next slide, we'll move on to interventional studies. Now, again, you heard a number of those interventional studies in Dr. French's presentation. There are different phases of interventional studies, and each of them involves more and more people. Phase 3 studies are usually the latest stage in development before a product goes to the FDA for approval. And so that's where the largest number of people are usually studied. And again, as larger and larger numbers of people are studied, the strength of that evidence goes up as well. So next slide. I just wanted to share some of the examples of interventional studies that are on the clinical trials portal right now. And you can see that they're for different types of epilepsy. They're for different age ranges of individuals. Some of them are for chronic treatment. Some of them are for rescue treatment. And so, and some of them are device studies, and some of them are drug studies. So I encourage you to go to the clinical trials portal and take a look at any of these that might be appealing. Next slide. Okay, the last type of studies that I'll talk about are implementation kinds of studies. And again, we're talking about increasing the numbers of people that we're observing so that we get better and better information about how safe the new product is and in whom the product has its best results. So next slide. An example of a system that we're building to do this is called the Epilepsy Learning Healthcare System. And this is really a partnership between epilepsy centers, the Epilepsy Foundation, and patients and families to design a system where you can do both healthcare for epilepsy and learn and do research to understand the results and improve on outcomes for everyone. So next slide is a bit of a graphic about a learning healthcare system, but the idea is that it's a system that does both care and research together to generate new knowledge. Next slide. And the way this works is centers, epilepsy centers that are participating will enroll participants, ask for their informed consent to use their information for research purposes. They will share that information to a registry, and the registry will collect information from many, many people treated at multiple centers. So we're learning from the experience that people are having all across the country. And the goal is to identify best practices that lead to better outcomes for people. So improved seizure freedom, improved seizure control, and better quality of life for people with epilepsy. And we hope that the research that can be done in a learning healthcare system will also tell us something about comparative effectiveness. So of all of those different drugs that are available for epilepsy, which one is best for whom, and which one is best at what time? So for example, what is the right first drug to choose for people who are diagnosed with epilepsy? So that's one example of a kind of research question you can try to answer with this approach. So next slide. This is the mission statement of the Epilepsy Learning Healthcare System's Community Engagement Core. And that's another unique feature of the Learning Healthcare System, is that this is a system that is built by doctors, by researchers, but also by patients and families themselves, working together with those teams. So next slide. We have a community engagement core that is led by Allison Kukla, and you see Allison in a couple of the photos there. Allison is an amazing person. She is a person with epilepsy. She has also been a staffer in the White House. She is a public health professional and leads our community engagement core, and she would love to hear from you if you're interested in getting involved in the learning healthcare system. So next slide. I wanted to wrap up with a few resources to learn more about clinical research studies. And any one of these websites offers really reliable and rigorous information about thinking through what it means to participate in a clinical research trial. So thank you so much for your attention, and I will turn it back to Dr. Kiriakopoulos.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fureman. So thank you both to you, Dr. Fureman and Dr. French, for sharing advances made in epilepsy and for sharing the ongoing work towards progress. Thank you also for helping everyone listening tonight better understand how they can both learn about advances in epilepsy and engage in research that's being done to improve health outcomes and quality of life in people living with epilepsy. We'd like to end the presentation portion of this evening's webinar sharing with you resources to help you continue to learn about epilepsy. So speaking with your physician or nurse is always a great place to start. Keep in mind that sometimes referral to an epilepsy center may be necessary for you to be able to help determine if your diagnosis is accurate, what treatment options are best suited to help you control your seizures, and also to help bring you more information about the possibility of participation in a clinical trial. You can also find up-to-date information online at epilepsy.com. And to stay up to date on advances in epilepsy and clinical trials, you can go to epilepsy.com/research. And if you would like to receive regular updates via email about research and advances in epilepsy, you can sign up for the research newsletter update right on this research webpage. For help guiding you to additional resources, you can call into the Foundation's 24/7 helpline. And in addition, your local Epilepsy Foundation office can help to provide you with information, resources, and support, and can also help to direct you to an epilepsy center that's close to your home, where you can find medical providers who specialize in the diagnosis and treatment of epilepsy. Next slide, please. So thank you again to our guest speakers this evening, Dr. French and Dr. Fureman. I'd also like to thank each of you for joining us this evening and hope you'll continue to join us throughout 2019 as we aim to provide you with learning opportunities that help to answer your questions and guide you to the resources you need to manage your epilepsy well.